The Middle Passage, the Atlantic slave trade. In order to establish profitable colonies, European countries needed a large supply of labor. Europeans enslaved indigenous peoples, but because many indigenous peoples were decimated by European disease and violence, indigenous slavery didn't meet the labor demands of the colonies. In the 16th century, Europeans began purchasing enslaved Africans from West African traders. The forced labor of Africans proved hugely profitable for Europe and its colonies. Slave owners didn't pay their slaves, and the lifelong and hereditary nature of slavery guaranteed new generations of free labor. In order to maximize profits for slave owners, working conditions for slaves in the colonies were often atrocious. Over the course of the next 4 centuries, it is estimated that more than 12.5 million Africans were taken from Africa. Due to the brutal conditions on the trip to the Americas, historians estimate that only 10.7 million of the captives survived. The vast majority of those slaves were taken to European colonies in South America and the Caribbean. The most recent estimates suggest that less than 400,000 slaves were taken directly from Africa to the present day United States. The Portuguese, British, French, Spanish, and Dutch were the main slave traders. The slave trade drastically changed African societies. In the centuries before the Atlantic slave trade, mutually beneficial intercontinental trade was an important part of African states' economies. Many of these relationships were replaced by the slave trade. In Africa, the slave trade destabilized states, created economic depressions, and led to wars. The Middle Passage. The Atlantic slave trade was part of a broader economic system known as the triangular trade that connected 3 continents. European traders would transport enslaved Africans to European colonies in the Americas, where the slaves would work to produce various agricultural goods, including sugar, cotton, and tobacco. Those raw goods were then shipped back to Europe in order to be turned into manufactured goods. European traders would subsequently trade those goods with West African slave traders for more kidnapped Africans, and the cycle would continue. It is important to note that there were also various exceptions to the basic outline. For instance, European manufactured goods were also sold to colonies in the Americas. Similarly, sugar produced in the Caribbean was sold in New England, and rum produced in the Americas was sold in Africa. So let's take a look down here. We go to the source, and we can see that this is a 10th grade world history textbook. It's published in Portugal. It's in 1994, so about 26, 27 years ago. And it's a high school textbook for world history, or Portuguese history, perhaps, not quite sure. But it's for 10th graders, just like you guys. And little context here in the box. Portugal is one of the first European countries to engage in the African slave trade. Portuguese ships played a key role to the slave trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas for several centuries. So while Portugal not only was participating as a nation in the slave trade, it also had a thriving business of providing ships for other countries and anybody that wanted to move human cargo from Africa to the Americas. And that occurs over a couple centuries. So again, here we have a Portuguese textbook, and just a short excerpt here. I'm going to draw your attention down to the first question we have is sourcing, and we're wondering what is the perspective of a Portuguese textbook? So down here it says, at the time, the European states did not recognize the negative consequences of these massive migrations. So the reference to negative consequences of what is essentially what we would refer to as slavery is how they deal with it here. And so our question is, what does that tell you about the perspective of the textbook? It doesn't condemn slavery necessarily. It does conclude and it does recognize negative consequences. So bad things happened, but the phrasing here is interesting: negative consequences. And then as we go along further, it says it refers to slavery as massive migrations, and that's interesting because normally migrations we would refer to as voluntary. Anytime, the most common form of migration is people moving to either get away from something or go to something better. And we refer to these as push pull factors. So, um, slavery we normally see as involuntary migration because they were bought and sold, chained, and put on ships against their will. So migration, the perspective again here that we get is that migration, which is normally voluntary and it usually includes push pull factors, the use of this term for slavery also gives us an idea, some background into how the Portuguese perceived the slave trade. And they see it more as a business and a migration as a byproduct, I think. So, but you can use your own, use your own judgment on that. These are two terms: negative consequences, massive migration. Um, Up here, this reinforces the idea that we mentioned in that earlier presentation that compared to Native Americans or Indian slavery, African black slaves had a better physical capacity and resisted better to the climate. This is an interesting phrasing here because, again, this is a 1994 textbook. A little shortly after that, the idea, the guns, germs, and steel theory becomes much more popular in the minds of historians, and it's the idea that Europeans were far more successful because they had guns, germs, and steel, and this reinforces that notion earlier that Native Americans were dying and were dead, and therefore did not make a great labor force because of European germs that had been brought over on the ships that otherwise had been confined to the other side of the world. Literally, on the other side of the world, there's these germs, and on the other side, another side of the world, there's these germs. Well, when those germs from the eastern hemisphere hit the Native Americans, it wiped them out, and so you needed a better free labor force. You needed better slaves, and that's why that created the demand for African slaves. Um, this point here, this is the second question that you have to deal with. The time between the moment the slaves were bought and when they arrived at port was very dangerous, not only for European traders but for the slaves as well. This is interesting because it's portraying uh, not just the slaves, not just the African slaves who are being sold and transported across, but it's also portraying Portuguese traders. So, and it says it concludes that it's dangerous for both sides. And then it goes on to some detail here. Even the whites had difficulty with these things. So this is an interesting perspective that while they were making money, while this was part of the business, the average Portuguese trader is probably some young sailor kid who's involved in this. And it's dangerous for that individual too. Still, we don't. Still, the question is are we getting a fair shake here? Is it by portraying the whites? Does that undermine or soften in any way what they refer to here as extremely difficult for slaves? Does it not? And that's really what you're challenged with this document. So. Anyway, so use these questions to bear out some other ideas of your own, and like we say, don't be afraid to take some chances. Just look for evidence to prove your claim.